In the winter of 1884, a letter was burned in the fireplace of the Alistair estate, a letter that would have changed the history of the British peerage. We are told that dukes marry for duty and earls sell their daughters for gold. But the scandal of Sebastian Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, was different. He stood in the ballroom of Greystone Hall, looked past the diamond of the season, the breathtaking Arabella Sterling, and pointed a gloved finger at the girl hiding behind the curtains. The girl with the ink-stained fingers and the plain grey dress. He didn't choose the prize. He chose the outcast. But this wasn't a fairy tale. It was an act of war. And the reason why he chose her would threaten to hang them all. The year was 1884. And the air in London smelled of coal smoke and desperation. To the outside world, Lord Archibald Sterling, the Earl of Greystone, was a pillar of society. He hosted the finest hunts, drank the oldest port, and possessed the most beautiful daughter in 3 counties, Lady Arabella Sterling. But inside the draughty corridors of Greystone Manor, the truth was rotting the floorboards. Archibald was broke. Not merely gentlemanly poor, where one has to sell a horse or 2. He was destitute. He had gambled away the sterling fortune at the card tables of the St. James Club, accumulating a debt of 40,000 to creditors who did not possess the patience of saints. "I need a duke," Archibald roared one rainy Tuesday morning, sweeping a pile of unpaid invoices off his mahogany desk. The papers fluttered down like dying birds. "I don't need a baron. I don't need a viscount. I need a bloody duke with deep pockets and shallow intelligence." Standing in the corner of the library, blending into the shadows of the bookshelves, was Isabella Sterling. At 21, Isabella was the other Sterling. If Arabella was a porcelain doll, golden-haired, blue-eyed, and sculpted for admiration, Isabella was the clay left over. Her hair was a mousy brown that refused to curl her eyes a sharp, unsettling hazel. She was too tall, too thin, and far too quiet. While Arabella was taught to sing, dance, and flirt, Isabella had been left to her own devices. She spent her days managing the household accounts that her father ignored, trying to stretch a sovereign to feed a staff of 20. "Arabella is ready," her father muttered, pacing the rug. "She is the bait. The Duke of Blackwood returns from the continent tomorrow. They say he is darker than his reputation, reclusive, arrogant, and richer than God." Isabella looked up from her ledger. "The Duke of Blackwood." Her voice was low, rarely used. "The one they call the Widower of Venice. Rumor says his first wife didn't fall from that balcony by accident, father." Archibald stopped pacing. He looked at Isabella with a sneer that had become his default expression when addressing her. "Rumors do not pay the butcher, Isabella. Rumors do not keep the roof over your plain little head. Arabella will marry him. She will smile, she will bear his heirs, and he will sign a check that clears my name. That is the way of the world. And if he refuses, he is a man." Archibald laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Men do not refuse Arabella." The plan was set. A grand ball was to be thrown at Greystone Manor to welcome Sebastian Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, back to English society. It was a gamble Archibald spent the last of his credit on beeswax candles, French wine, and a dress of crushed blue velvet for Arabella that cost more than a farm worker earned in a decade. Isabella was given a task, too. "Stay out of sight," her father ordered. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not humiliate us with your sullenness. Better yet, help the servants in the kitchen. You have the hands for it." On the night of the ball, The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels. The orchestra played Strauss, but underneath the music, the tension was palpable. Every family with a marriageable daughter was there, but they all knew the game was rigged. The Earl of Greystone was selling his prize filly. Then the doors opened. The room went silent. Sebastian Alistair entered. He was not the monster the broadsheets depicted, nor was he the Prince Charming the debutantes dreamed of. He was tall, severe, clad in black evening wear that seemed to absorb the candlelight. A scar ran faintly through his left eyebrow. A souvenir, it was whispered, of a duel in Paris. His eyes were cold, scanning the room, not with interest, but with the detached calculation of a predator assessing a herd. Archibald practically ran to him, dragging Arabella by the arm. Arabella curtsied, a perfect, practiced motion that displayed the swan-like curve of her neck. "Your Grace," Archibald boomed, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. "Welcome to Greystone. May I present my daughter, the Lady Arabella, the jewel of our home." Arabella batted her lashes. "It is an honor, Your Grace." Sebastian looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Most men melted when Arabella looked at them. Sebastian merely looked bored. "A jewel indeed," Sebastian said, his voice a deep baritone that carried no warmth. "Though I find jewels are often cold to the touch, Lord Greystone." Archibald laughed nervously. "A wit. Come, Your Grace, dance with her. Let us show London what perfection looks like." The music swelled. The crowd parted. It was supposed to be the moment that saved the Sterling family. But Sebastian didn't offer his hand to Arabella. His gaze drifted past her shoulder, past the velvet ropes, past the anxious mothers. He looked toward the far alcove near the service entrance. Isabella was standing there. She wasn't supposed to be seen. She had come up only to check that the wine steward wasn't drinking the inventory. She wore a simple grey gown, patched at the hem, her hair pulled back in a severe, practical knot. She held a ledger in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. Their eyes locked across the ballroom. In that second, Isabella felt a jolt of electricity that was almost painful. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands, the ink stains, the keys, the evidence of work. Sebastian took a step forward, then another. He walked right past Arabella, leaving her hand hovering in the air. A collective gasp ripped through the room. He stopped in front of Isabella. He towered over her, smelling of sandalwood and rain. "And who?" Sebastian asked, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Is this Archibald?" Scrambled over his face, turning purple. That is nobody, Your Grace. My youngest, Isabella. She is of no consequence. She handles the domestic affairs, a dull creature. Please, Arabella is waiting." Sebastian ignored him. He looked down at Isabella. "You handle the affairs, you manage this estate." Isabella tightened her grip on the ledger. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I try, Your Grace, though the math is often unforgiving." A ghost of a smile touched Sebastian's lips. It was a terrifying expression. "Unforgiving math. I know it well." He turned slowly to Archibald. The room was deathly quiet. Even the violins had stopped. "You offer me the pretty one," Sebastian said, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "You offer me beauty, fluff, and expense. I have no need for decorations, Lord Greystone. My house is crumbling under the weight of mismanagement and thieves. I do not need a wife to sit on a cushion and embroider. I need a partner who knows how to spot a lie in a ledger." He turned back to Isabella and extended his hand. It was a demand, not a request. I choose her." The silence that followed the Duke's declaration was not the silence of peace. It was the vacuum before an explosion. Archibald Stirling's face drained of blood, then rushed back in a violent shade of crimson. You jest your grace. Isabella. She is a spinster in the making. She is 21 and has never danced a waltz. She is plain, she is sour, and she is the one I want." Sebastian interrupted, his tone final. "Or is your offer of an alliance a lie?" "Lord Greystone." "Are you refusing the Duke of Blackwood?" The threat was implicit. Archibald owed money to men who broke kneecaps. He could not afford to offend the richest man in England, even if the man was insane. Arabella let out a high, keening sob and fled the ballroom, her blue velvet skirts trailing behind her like a fallen sky. The guests began to whisper a buzzing hive of scandal that would reach London by morning. Sebastian did not waver. He kept his hand extended toward Isabella. Isabella looked at the gloved hand. She looked at her father, who was staring at her with a mixture of hatred and desperation. She knew what this was. This wasn't romance. This was a transaction. She was being bought just as Arabella would have been, but for a different purpose. Arabella was a vase. Isabella was a plough horse. But looking at her father, the man who had called her worthless every day of her life, she felt a sudden cold resolve. She placed her ink-stained hand in the Duke's palm. "I accept," Isabella whispered. "Good," Sebastian said. "Pack your things. We leave for Blackwood Manor tonight." "Tonight?" Archibald sputtered. "But the proprieties, the banns." "I have a special license," Sebastian said dismissively. "And I have no patience for pageantry. The bishop is waiting in my carriage." The wedding took place an hour later in the draughty vestry of the local parish. There were no flowers, no guests, just a trembling Archibald, a weeping Arabella, who had been dragged back to witness it, and the stone-faced Duke. When Isabella signed the register, her hand didn't shake. She signed Isabella Stirling, knowing it was the last time she would use that name. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. She had jumped from the frying pan into the fire. But at least this was a different fire. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was 4 hours of suffocating silence. Sebastian sat on the opposite bench reading correspondence by the light of a small lantern, ignoring her completely. Isabella studied him. He was handsome, yes, but in a brutal way. He looked tired, not sleepy, but weary in his soul. "Whoa," she asked finally. Her voice sounded too loud in the small cabin. Sebastian didn't look up from his papers. "Why what? Why me? You could have had Arabella. She is everything a duke is supposed to want. I am nothing." Sebastian finally looked at her. The lantern light cast deep shadows over his eyes. "Do you know why they call me the widower of Venice, Isabella? They say you killed your wife. They say a lot of things. My first wife, Clarissa, was like your sister. Beautiful, vain, and entirely consumed by the need to be adored. She spent my fortune on parties while my tenants starved. She filled my house with sycophants and debt. I didn't push her from that balcony. She fell because she was drunk on champagne and leaning over to wave at a lover." Isabella went cold. "I am on the brink of ruin, Isabella." He confessed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Blackwood Manor is vast, but the coffers are bleeding. I have enemies in Parliament who want to see the Alistair name destroyed. I don't need a wife to love. I need a wife to help me go to war. I watched you tonight. I saw you counting the bottles. I saw you checking the exits. You are vigilant. You are practical. And you are used to being hated." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "That is what I need. Because where we are going, everyone will hate you. My staff is loyal to my late wife's memory. My family thinks I am a murderer. If you thought your father was cruel, wait until you meet my mother, the Dowager Duchess. You are not my beloved Isabella. You are my business partner. Do we understand each other?" Isabella felt a strange sense of relief. There were no lies here, no flowery poetry masking a cage. It was a job, and she was good at jobs. "We understand each other," Isabella said, lifting her chin. "But I have a condition." Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "You are in no position to bargain." "I am the Duchess of Blackwood now," she said, her voice steadying. "If I am to save your estate, if I am to fight your battles, you will never treat me as my father did. You will not ignore me. You will not mock me. And you will never ever compare me to Arabella." Sebastian stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Agreed." The carriage jolted as it turned onto a gravel drive. Lightning flashed, illuminating a massive Gothic structure looming against the night sky. Blackwood Manor. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. "Welcome home, Duchess," Sebastian muttered. But as they stepped out into the rain, Isabella saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in the doorway of the manor was a row of servants, all dressed in black. And at the center stood an older woman with silver hair and eyes like flint, the Dowager Duchess. She didn't look at Sebastian. She looked straight at Isabella. And she didn't curtsy. "So," the Dowager hissed, her voice cutting through the wind, "this is the creature you brought to replace Clarissa. She looks like a scullery maid." Sebastian gripped Isabella's arm. "Mother." "Don't speak to me, Sebastian," the Dowager snapped. She walked up to Isabella, invading her personal space. "You may wear the ring, girl. You may share his name. But you will never be the mistress of this house. The ghosts here are very jealous, and they do not like intruders." Isabella felt the cold seep into her bones. She realized then that Sebastian hadn't told her the whole truth. He hadn't just hired her to fix the accounts. He had brought her here as a shield. And as they walked into the great hall, Isabella saw a portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was draped in black cloth, but the wind from the open door blew the fabric aside for just a second. The woman in the painting, Clarissa, didn't look like Arabella. She looked exactly like Isabella. The first morning at Blackwood Manor did not break. It bruised. The light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the master suite was grey and reluctant, as if the sun itself hesitated to touch the stones of the estate. Isabella had spent her wedding night alone. Sebastian had escorted her to the door of the suite, handed her a heavy iron key, and said simply, "Lock it from the inside." He had then turned on his heel and walked down the darkened corridor, disappearing into the west wing, where the servants whispered he kept his private study, a room no one had entered since the night Clarissa died. Now Isabella sat on the edge of a bed, large enough to sleep 4 people. The room was suffocating. It was clearly her room, Clarissa's room. The vanity was still crowded with crystal perfume bottles, silver hairbrushes, and pots of rouge that had cracked with age. The air smelled faintly of stale lavender and Eau de Decay. Isabella stood up and walked to the mirror. She wore a plain cotton nightgown, the only one she had brought from Greystone. She looked at her reflection, the sharp cheekbones, the pale skin, the hazel eyes that always looked too serious. She thought of the portrait she had seen in the hall. The woman in the painting had been painted in a style of high glamour. Cheeks, flushed lips, red hair, piled high in golden curls. But the bone structure, the distance between the eyes, the curve of the jaw. It was Isabella's face hiding under a masquerade of paint. Why, she thought. Why marry a woman who looks like the wife you were accused of killing? Is it penance, or is it a taunt? A sharp knock at the door broke her reverie. Isabella unlocked it to reveal a young maid no older than 16, trembling so hard the water pitcher in her hands rattled against the basin. "Good morning, Your Grace," the girl squeaked. Her eyes darted around the room, terrified to look at the bed. I am to dress you." "What is your name?" Isabella asked, gently stepping aside. "Daisy, ma'am." "Daisy, why are you shaking?" The girl bit her lip. "The staff. They said you wouldn't last the night, ma'am. They said the grey lady, Mistress Clarissa, would come for anyone who slept in her bed." Isabella felt a chill, but she forced a calm smile. "Well, as you can see, I am quite alive, and I prefer to dress myself. But you can tell me where the Duke is." "He is in the library, Your Grace. He has been there since 4 in the morning." Isabella dressed quickly in her grey wool dress, her working armour, and descended the grand staircase. The house was magnificent, but clearly dying. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light. There were darker patches on the walls where paintings had been sold off. The carpets were threadbare in the centre. To a guest, it was a castle. To Isabella, who spoke the language of household economy, it was a scream for help. She found the library doors ajar. Inside the room was a chaotic sea of parchment. Books were pulled from shelves and left on the floor. Ledgers were stacked in precarious towers. Sebastian was sitting behind a massive oak desk, his head in his hands. He had removed his tailcoat and cravat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the tense cords of his neck. He looked exhausted, a man holding up the sky. Isabella didn't knock. She walked in and began picking up the books from the floor. Sebastian's head snapped up. His eyes were bloodshot. "I didn't call for a maid." "I am not a maid," Isabella said, placing a heavy volume of maritime law back on the shelf. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and I believe we have work to do." Sebastian stared at her, blinking as if trying to bring her into focus. "I told you to rest. The audit can wait." "The audit cannot wait if you are selling paintings to pay for coal," Isabella replied softly. She walked to the desk and placed her hand on the stack of papers he was agonizing over. "Move over, Sebastian." It was the first time she had used his Christian name. He stiffened, then slowly exhaled a long, ragged sound. He stood up and moved to the side. Isabella sat in his chair. The leather was still warm from his body. She pulled the ledger toward her. It was the general account for the year 1883. She dipped a quill in the inkwell and began to read. The silence stretched for 10 minutes, broken only by the scratching of her pen and the ticking of the grandfather clock. Sebastian leaned against the window frame watching her. He expected her to be overwhelmed. He expected her to ask what the terms meant. "Here," Isabella said, her voice cutting the silence. She didn't look up. Page 42. You paid $400 for timber repairs on the tenant cottages in the North Valley. Yes, Sebastian said wearily. The roofs were collapsing. It had to be done. No, Isabella corrected him. She tapped the page. You paid for timber. But looking at the supply manifest on page 10, no timber was delivered in October. The payment went to a company called Vane & Sons. But 2 pages later, you paid a separate carpenter for materials and labor for the same job. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp. You paid for the wood twice, Sebastian, but only one load arrived. Who is Vane? Sebastian's face darkened. Silas Vane. He is the estate steward. He has served this family for 30 years. He held me when I was a boy. Then he has been stealing from you since you were a boy, Isabella said flatly. This isn't an error. This is embezzlement, and it's clumsy. He thinks you are too grief-stricken or too arrogant to check the line items. Sebastian pushed off the wall and walked to the desk, looking over her shoulder. The smell of him sandalwood and stale tobacco enveloped her. He traced the line she had found. £400, he whispered. That could have paid the wages for the entire stable staff for a year. There is more, Isabella said, flipping the page. The wine cellar, the grain shipments, the livery bills. It's a hemorrhage, Sebastian. You aren't poor because the land is failing. You are poor because you are being eaten alive by the people you trust. For a moment, there was a shared energy between them, a spark of partnership. Sebastian looked at her, not as the unwanted sister, but as a weapon he had successfully acquired. So, he said, his voice low, how do we stop it? Before Isabella could answer, the library doors banged open. The Dowager Duchess Victoria Alistair swept into the room. She was dressed in mourning black, though Clarissa had been dead for 3 years. She carried a cane she did not need, using it to thump against the floorboards. What is the meaning of this? Victoria hissed her eyes, locking onto Isabella sitting in the Duke's chair. Get up, girl. That is the Duke's seat. You look like a child playing at governance. Isabella didn't move. She kept her hand on the ledger. Mother. Sebastian warned, his voice turning cold again. Isabella is helping me review the accounts. Helping? Victoria laughed, a cruel metallic sound. She is a sterling. Her father is a gambler and a cheat. Do you think the apple falls far from the tree? She is likely looking for what is left to steal for her dowry. She marched up to the desk and slammed her cane down on the open ledger, cracking the spine. Leave us, Victoria commanded Isabella. I wish to speak to my son. Isabella looked at Sebastian. She was waiting for him to defend her, to honor the agreement they made in the carriage. I am your partner, she thought. Prove it. Sebastian looked at his mother, then at Isabella. His jaw tightened. He looked away. Leave us, Isabella, he muttered. Isabella felt the betrayal like a physical slap. She slowly closed the ledger, picked up her pen, and stood up. She didn't curtsy to the dowager. She simply walked out of the room, head held high. But as she closed the heavy oak doors, she heard Victoria's voice, clear and venomous. Why did you bring her here, Sebastian? Do you think putting her face in Clarissa's bed will make the guilt go away? She knows nothing. If she digs too deep, she will find the payments to the asylum. And then, my son, we will all hang. Isabella froze her hand on the doorknob. The asylum. She realized then that the theft of £400 for timber was the least of the secrets buried in the Blackwood ledgers. For the next 3 days, a cold war settled over Blackwood Manor. Isabella did not dine with the family. She took her meals on a tray in her room, brought by Daisy, the terrified maid, who was slowly warming to her new mistress. Daisy had begun to whisper secrets, small things. The cook hates the dowager. The head groom drinks. Mr. Vane, the steward, carries a pistol. Isabella spent her days in the secondary study, a small, draughty room near the kitchen that had been abandoned. She had instructed Daisy to sneak ledgers out of the main library one by one. If Sebastian wouldn't let her work in the light, she would work in the dark. She built a map of the estate's ruin. It was systematic. Silas Vane, the steward, was indeed the ringleader, but he wasn't working alone. The conspiracy involved the local magistrate, the grain merchant, and someone listed in the books only as CM. The payments to CM were irregular but massive. £1,000 here, £500 there. They were labelled as charitable donations, but Isabella knew better. You don't donate to charity when your roof is leaking. On the fourth afternoon, Isabella decided she had enough evidence to confront Sebastian again. She needed to prove she wasn't just a sterling, but the salvation of this house. She was organizing her notes when the door opened. It wasn't Sebastian. It was Silas Vane. The steward was a man of 60, with a face like a crumpled paper bag, and eyes that were too small for his head. He wore a suit that was too expensive for a servant. He didn't knock. "Your Grace," Vane said, his voice oily. "I was told you were down here, poking about." Isabella didn't stand. She remained seated, keeping the desk between them. "I am auditing the household expenses, Mr. Vane. Is there a problem?" Vane smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Auditing is a man's work, Your Grace. The Duke is unwell. He is prone to flights of fancy. He worries about money where there is no need to worry. There is a need when timber is paid for, but never delivered," Isabella said, her voice steady, despite the rapid beating of her heart. Vane's smile vanished. "You are a clever little thing, aren't you?" Much sharper than the first one. Clarissa never looked at a book. She only looked at mirrors. He walked closer, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. "But cleverness is dangerous here, Duchess. The Sterling family is known for bad luck. It would be a tragedy if you were to have an accident. These old floors are slippery. These staircases are steep." It was a naked threat. Isabella stood up slowly. She was tall, and she used every inch of her height. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Vane?" "I am advising you," Vane hissed. "Go back to your embroidery. Leave the numbers to the men. The Duke does not want you here. He only married you because he needed a broodmare, and your father sold you cheap." Isabella's hand found the heavy brass inkwell on the desk. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white. "Get out," she said. Vane laughed. "Or what you'll tell him?" "He won't believe you. I raised him. You are just the replacement." "I said get out," Isabella shouted, hurling the inkwell. She missed his head by inches. The heavy brass pot smashed against the doorframe, shattering and spraying black ink across the wood and across Vane's cheek. Vane touched the ink on his face. He looked at his black-stained fingers, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected the mouse to bite. "You will regret that," he whispered. He turned and fled the room. Isabella sank back into her chair, trembling. She wasn't afraid of Vane. She was afraid because she realized Vane wasn't scared of Sebastian, which meant Vane held power over the Duke. She needed to find Sebastian immediately. She found him in the stables. He was grooming a massive black stallion himself, his movements aggressive and rhythmic. He was sweating despite the cold. "Sebastian," she said, approaching the stall. He didn't stop brushing the horse. "I told you to stay out of my way, Isabella. My mother is on a warpath." "Your steward just threatened my life," Isabella said. The brushing stopped. Sebastian slowly turned around. The horse shifted nervously behind him. "What did you say, ma?" "Silas Vane came to my study." He told me that if I kept looking at the books, I might have an accident. He told me I was sold cheap, and he implied that he knows things about you that make him untouchable. Sebastian dropped the brush. He walked over to the wooden railing, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Vane is difficult, Sebastian said. But he wouldn't hurt you. He hurt you, Isabella snapped, losing her patience. He is stealing thousands of pounds, and you let him. Why are you so afraid of your own servants? Because they know. Sebastian roared, the explosion sudden and terrifying. The horse reared in the stall. They know what? Isabella shouted back, not backing down. That you didn't kill Clarissa. I know that you told me. They know she was mad. Sebastian yelled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. They know she wasn't the angel everyone thinks she was. Clarissa wasn't murdered, Isabella. She was insane. She set fires in the nursery. She attacked the maids. I spent every penny I had paying doctors, paying bribes to keep the police away, paying the staff to keep their mouths shut so she wouldn't be dragged away to Bedlam in chains. The silence that followed was heavy with the dust of hay and secrets. Sebastian leaned against the stall door, defeated. Vane knows. My mother knows. That is where the money went, Isabella. Not just gambling, blackmail, silence money. Vane has letters. If he releases them, the Alistair name is ruined. They will dig up her body. They will see the scars on her wrists. They will brand me a monster for locking her up in her own home. Isabella stared at him. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. The hostility of the staff, they were paid to keep secrets. The dowager's protectiveness, she was protecting the family name, not Clarissa. And the debt, it was the price of reputation. She looked at Sebastian, seeing not a tyrant, but a man who had been held hostage in his own home for years. Isabella walked up to the railing. She reached through the bars and took his hand. It was rough and calloused. Sebastian, she said firmly, you are looking at this like a duke. You think you have to pay the toll to cross the bridge. He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. And how do you look at it? I look at it like a woman who has had to stretch a penny into a pound her whole life, Isabella said. You don't pay the toll, Sebastian. You burn the bridge. What are you saying? Vane thinks he has the leverage, Isabella said, her mind racing, calculating, plotting. But he made a mistake. He put his theft in the ledgers. He got greedy. He mixed the blackmail payments with the timber and the wine. He made it a crime. She squeezed his hand. If we expose the theft, his credibility is destroyed. A thief's word against a duke's no court will listen to him about Clarissa if he is standing in the dock for embezzlement. It's a gamble, Sebastian said, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. My father is a gambler, Isabella said with a dark smile. I learned a few things, but we need to be fast, and we need to be ruthless. Vane knows I am onto him. He will move tonight. Sebastian straightened up. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her for the second time. You are dangerous, Isabella Sterling. I am Isabella Alistair now, she corrected him. And no one steals from my house. What do we do? Tonight, Isabella whispered. There is a dinner for the local magistrate. Your mother organized it. Vane will be serving the wine. We are going to do something that hasn't been done in this house for a long time. What? We are going to tell the truth, or at least a version of it. But as they plotted in the fading light of the stables, neither of them noticed the shadow lingering near the tack-room door. Daisy, the timid maid, stood in the darkness, clutching a small vial of clear liquid she had been given by the Dowager Duchess. Tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Daisy whispered to the empty air. "She said she'd turn my family out if I didn't do it." Daisy slipped the vial into her pocket and headed back to the kitchen, where the soup for the Duchess's dinner was simmering on the stove. The dining room at Blackwood Manor was a cavern of shadows and mahogany. A fire roared in the grate, but it did little to chase away the damp chill that seemed to radiate from the stone walls. The table was set for 4. The Duke, the new Duchess, the Dowager Duchess, and the local magistrate, Sir Thomas Redding. Sir Thomas was a rotund man, with a red face and a loud laugh, oblivious to the fact that he was dining in a snake pit. He was talking at length about the price of barley and the drainage of the fenlands. "You must drain the lower fields, Your Grace," Sir Thomas boomed, slicing into a pheasant. "It's the only way to keep the rot out." Sebastian sat at the head of the table. He wore his formal evening dress, the starched white collar pressing against his throat. He looked like a statue carved from marble, cold, pale, and unmoving. He gripped his wineglass so tightly that Isabella feared the stem would snap. Isabella sat to his right. She had refused to wear any of Clarissa's abandoned gowns. Instead, she wore her best dress from Greystone, a deep plum silk that was 3 seasons out of fashion, but fitted her slender frame perfectly. Around her neck, however, she wore the heavy silver locket Sebastian had given her an hour before dinner. "It belonged to my grandmother," he had said. "It marks you as the mistress of this house. Wear it like armor." Across from her sat the Dowager Duchess Victoria. The older woman was cutting her meat with surgical precision. She had not looked at Isabella once since they sat down. Her eyes were fixed on the centerpiece, a silver bowl filled with dying winter roses. "And how is the new bride settling in?" Sir Thomas asked, turning his watery eyes toward Isabella. "A bit of a change from Greystone, I imagine." "It is extensive, Sir Thomas," Isabella said, her voice steady. "I am learning the history of the house. It is full of surprises." "Surprises?" Sir Thomas chuckled. "Indeed, the Alistairs have always been full of surprises. Tragically so in the past." He glanced awkwardly at the portrait of Sebastian's father on the wall, then quickly took a drink of wine. The doors to the kitchen swung open. The servants entered to clear the pheasant and serve the soup course. Silas Vane stood by the sideboard overseeing the service like a hawk. His face was still bruised where the inkwell had struck him, a purple-black mark blooming on his cheekbone. He caught Isabella's eye and offered a microscopic, mocking bow. Daisy entered carrying a silver tureen. The girl looked like a ghost. Her skin was the color of parchment, and sweat beaded on her upper lip despite the draughty room. Her hands shook violently, the ladle rattling against the side of the tureen. "Careful, girl," the dowager snapped. "Do not spill it. That is French lace." Yes, Your Grace," Daisy whispered. Daisy moved around the table. She served Sir Thomas first, then the dowager, then Sebastian. Finally, she came to Isabella. Isabella watched the girl's hands. She saw the way Daisy's knuckles were white. She saw the terror in the girl's eyes, a terror that went beyond the fear of spilling soup. It was the terror of a soul being crushed. Daisy ladled the soup, a thick, creamy mushroom bisque, into Isabella's bowl. As she pulled the ladle away, a single drop fell onto the tablecloth. "Clumsy fool," Vane hissed from the corner. Daisy flinched, as if struck. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Isabella looked down at the soup. It smelled of earth and cream. But underneath, was there something else? A bitterness? Or was it just her imagination? She picked up her spoon. Across the table, the dowager stopped eating. She was watching Isabella. Her eyes were predatory, unblinking. She was waiting. Sebastian, too, had stopped. He was looking at his mother, then at Isabella. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and Sir Thomas slurping his broth. Isabella lifted the spoon to her lips. Then she stopped. She didn't look at the soup. She looked at Daisy, who was standing by the wall, wringing her apron. Tears silently streaming down her face. "Daisy," Isabella said softly. The room went silent. Sir Thomas lowered his spoon. "My dear Daisy," Isabella repeated, turning in her chair to face the maid. "Why are you crying?" I have a cold." "Your Grace." Daisy stammered, her voice breaking. "No," Isabella said. She stood up slowly. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. "You are not sick. You are terrified." Isabella picked up her soup bowl. She walked around the table, the heavy silk of her dress rustling. She stopped in front of the Dowager Duchess. "Mother, what are you doing?" Sebastian asked, rising from his seat. "Sit down, Sebastian," the Dowager commanded, her eyes never leaving Isabella. Isabella placed the bowl in front of the Dowager. "You seem to be enjoying the soup, Victoria," Isabella said, her voice ringing clear in the silence. "But mine seems to be seasoned differently. Would you care to taste it?" The Dowager stared at the bowl. Her face was a mask of aristocratic disdain, but a small muscle in her jaw twitched. "Don't be ridiculous," the Dowager scoffed. "It is all from the same pot." "Then eat it," Isabella challenged. "One spoonful." "I have had enough," the Dowager said, pushing the bowl away. "You are making a scene in front of the magistrate. It is just as your father said, you are hysterical." "I am not hysterical," Isabella shouted, slamming her hand onto the table. The silver jumped. "Daisy, tell them what is in the bowl." Daisy collapsed. She fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "She made me do it," Daisy wailed. "She said she'd turn my mother out of the cottage. She gave me the vial. It's rat poison. It's rat poison." Sir Thomas dropped his wine glass. It shattered red liquid, spreading across the white cloth like blood. "Good God!" Sir Thomas gasped. Sebastian moved faster than thought. He vaulted over the table, ignoring the china, and grabbed Sinus Vane by the throat, just as the steward reached for the pistol inside his jacket. "Don't move!" Sebastian roared, slamming Vane against the panelled wall. "Don't you dare move!" Isabella stood at the table, breathing hard. She looked at the Dowager. Victoria Alastair didn't look frightened. She didn't look remorseful. She looked annoyed, as if a servant had merely dropped a tray. "It was for the family, Sebastian," the Dowager said, calmly, smoothing her napkin. "She is a weed. You have to pull weeds before they choke the garden. Just like Clarissa." The dining room had transformed from a place of suffocating etiquette into a tribunal. The pheasant lay cold on the table, forgotten, amidst the wreckage of shattered crystal and spilled wine. Sir Thomas Redding, no longer the bumbling dinner guest, but now fully the magistrate of the county, sat at the head of the table. His face was grave as he scribbled notes into a pocketbook. In the corner, Silas Vane sat bound to a heavy oak chair, his hands tied with a velvet curtain cord. The Dowager Duchess remained by the fire, staring into the flames, her expression one of bored detachment, as if she were merely waiting for a carriage in the rain. "Attempted murder," Sir Thomas muttered the scratch of his pen loud in the silence. By poison, testified to by the maid Daisy, corroborated by the presence of arsenic in the scullery. He looked up, his eyes hard. This is a hanging offence. It was pest control. Vane spat from his chair, blood trickling from his lip where Sebastian had struck him. The girl is a weed. She was digging where she didn't belong. Isabella stepped forward. She had retrieved her portfolio from the sideboard, the weapon she had been forging for 4 days in the dark. Digging into your theft, Mr. Vane, Isabella asked, her voice calm. She placed the stack of papers in front of the magistrate. Sir Thomas, this estate generates £40,000 a year, yet the roof leaks and the Duke is in debt. These are the real ledgers. I have cross-referenced the supply manifests with the bank deposits. She opened the book, pointing to columns circled in red ink. Here, October 1882. £5,000 for structural repairs to the West Wing. No repairs were made. The money was deposited into a private account in London under the name S. Vane. And here, £3,000 for medical expenses paid to a non-existent doctor. Sebastian froze. He looked at the ledger, then at Vane. Medical expenses. Vane laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. Go on, Your Grace. Tell the magistrate what you really paid for. Tell him about the mad wife. The room went deathly still. This was the moment Vane had banked on. The blackmail. Clarissa wasn't murdered. Vane sneered, looking directly at Sir Thomas. She was mad, violent. She tried to burn the house down. The Duke locked her in the attic like an animal to hide his shame. He paid me to keep it quiet. If I go down for embezzlement, Duke, I'm taking you down for unlawful imprisonment. The Alistair name will be ruined. Sebastian looked defeated. The weight of the secret he had carried for 3 years seemed to crush him. He opened his mouth, perhaps to dismiss the magistrate, to bury it all again, to save the family name. No, Isabella said firmly. She stepped between Sebastian and Vane, shielding her husband. That is a fascinating story, Mr. Vane, Isabella said, but you have miscalculated. And how is that little mouse? You assume the law will see it as a crime, Isabella said, turning to Sir Thomas. My husband bankrupted himself to keep his sick wife safe at home, employing private care rather than throwing her into the horrors of Bedlam Asylum. He protected her dignity at the cost of his own fortune. That is not a crime, Sir Thomas. That is a tragedy. That is love. She leaned down, her face inches from Vane's. But stealing £5,000, forging documents, poisoning a duchess to cover your tracks. Those are crimes, and unlike the Duke, you have no title to hide behind. Sir Thomas stood up, snapping his notebook shut. The verdict was in his eyes. I have heard enough, the magistrate announced. Mr. Vane, you are under arrest for grand larceny and conspiracy to commit murder. I will have the constable here within the hour. You can't, Vane screamed, struggling against the ropes. I have the letters, I have proof. Burn them, Sir Thomas said to Sebastian. It is a cold night. Fires are necessary. As Vane shouted obscenities, Sebastian walked slowly to his mother. The Dowager Duchess finally looked up from the fire. Mother, he said softly, you are weak, Sebastian. She whispered, her voice like dry leaves. You chose the shopkeeper's daughter over your own blood. She is my wife, Sebastian said, his voice hardening. And she is the only person in this house who has ever fought for me. You will leave tonight. You will go to the Dower House, and you will never step foot in this manor again. The Dowager stood up, smoothing her skirts. She looked at Isabella with pure, distilled hatred. You think you have won, the old woman hissed. But you haven't seen the attic yet, have you? You haven't read what Clarissa left behind." She laughed, a cruel, rattling sound. "Go look in the tower, girl. Go see why she really jumped." The servants escorted the dowager out. Vane was dragged away by the magistrate's men. Suddenly the great hall was quiet. Isabella sank into a chair, her legs giving way as the adrenaline faded. Sebastian was there instantly, kneeling before her, taking her ink-stained hands in his. "You saved me," he whispered, pressing his forehead against her palms. "You saved us all." "Not all of us," Isabella said, her voice trembling. "Sebastian." What did she mean? About the attic? Sebastian went stiff. The fear returned to his eyes, not of the law, but of the ghosts he hadn't exorcised. "There is a diary," he admitted. "Clarissa kept a diary. I never had the courage to read it. I locked it away in the room where she died." "We have to read it," Isabella said, standing up. "We have to know the truth. No more secrets." Sebastian nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted iron key. "It's in the west tower," he said. Hand in hand, they walked out of the dining room, leaving the broken glass behind, and began the long climb up the spiral stairs toward the truth. The west tower room was frozen in time. A layer of dust coated the vanity, where Clarissa had once sat, and the windows were barred with iron, a precaution Sebastian had taken too late. Isabella sat on the floor, the leather-bound diary open in her lap. Sebastian sat beside her, holding a lantern. His hand rested on her shoulder, trembling slightly. They had been reading for an hour. The diary was a descent into hell. It detailed the dowager's cruelty, the constant criticism, the isolation, the whisperings that Clarissa was barren, useless, a pretty ornament with nothing inside. But on the final page, dated the day before she died, the handwriting became clear and calm. "I saw her again today." Isabella read aloud, her voice wavering. "The sterling girl, not the golden one, Arabella, whom they all fawn over. The other one. The shadow. I saw her at the village market when the carriage passed. She was arguing with a merchant about the price of grain. She looked fierce. She looked useful." Isabella stopped, her breath catching. Sebastian leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "I wish I were her," the entry continued. "I wish I were plain. I wish I were invisible. If I were ugly, they would not treat me like a doll to be kept in a box. They would let me work. They would let me live. The world loves the pretty ones, but it is the invisible ones who survive. If I jump tomorrow, it is not because I am mad. It is because I am tired of being a portrait. I want to be real, but I don't know how." Silence filled the tower. Sebastian took the book from Isabella's hands. Tears streamed down his face. Tears he had held back for 3 years. "She didn't hate you," he whispered. "She envied you." Isabella looked at the barred window. For her entire life, she had been told that her lack of beauty was a curse. Her father had hidden her. The world had ignored her. But Clarissa, the woman who had everything, had died longing for the very anonymity Isabella possessed. "She wasn't mad," Isabella said softly. "She was just empty, and they wouldn't let her fill herself with anything but their expectations." Sebastian stood up and offered his hand to Isabella. "And you? Do you feel empty?" Isabella looked at him. She saw the man who had defended her against his own mother. She saw the partner who had handed her the keys to his kingdom. "No," Isabella said, taking his hand. "I feel necessary." The next morning, the carriage arrived to take the Dowager Duchess to the dower house miles away from the estate. She left without a word. Archibald Sterling. Isabella's father arrived at noon, expecting a check for his debts. Instead, he was met at the gate by Sebastian. "Your debts are paid," Sebastian told the Earl. "Consider it the price for your daughter, but you are no longer welcome on this land. You sold me a diamond disguised as a stone Archibald. You were too stupid to see her value. I will not make the same mistake." Archibald was turned away, leaving Greystone Manor to crumble while Blackwood Manor began to rise. Years later, history would forget the scandal of the poison and the theft. They would only remember the golden era of Blackwood, a time when the estate flourished, the debts were cleared, and the tenant farmers lived in prosperity. They say that Sebastian Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, never looked at another woman. And every year, on the anniversary of the day they met, he would give his wife a gift. Not a necklace, nor a gown, nor a jewel. He gave her a ledger, because he knew that was the only love letter she ever wanted to read. And that is the true untold story of the Sterling sisters. History often focuses on the gowns and the galas, on the pretty ones, like Arabella who capture the eye. But as the tragedy of Clarissa and the triumph of Isabella show us, beauty is often a golden cage. Isabella Sterling wasn't chosen because she was the prize. She was chosen because she was the partner, in a world that told her she was nothing, because she wasn't beautiful. She proved that being capable, fierce, and intelligent is the most dangerous kind of beauty there is. The Duke didn't need a decoration. He needed a savior. And he found her hiding in the shadows. What a journey. I want to know what you think. If you were the Duke, would you have chosen the perfect Arabella or the rejected Isabella? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical romance and the dark secrets of the aristocracy, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a scandal. I have another story coming next week about a prince who abdicated for a seamstress, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching and see you in the next chapter.